Hello, welcome aboard down below on Pride of Baltimore 2. My name is Jan Miles and I'm a captain with Pride of Baltimore 2 and have been for quite some time. We're doing something we've not done before, and that is Coffee With. And I have as our producer, the chief mate, Jeff Crosby, who's handling the visual part of this thing.
Hi there.
And so we're going to start off with answering the one key question.
So we got a question in from Michael. Have you ever filmed the entire process of putting Pride about? Do you ever leave the fore topsail set while tacking? And how small of a turning circle can you have, a few boat lengths, etc.? A lot to digest there.
Yes, we do leave the square topsail set for a tack. It's a very important sail for just plain sailing to windward. So we're not going to take it in and reset it and take it in and reset it, because it's a valuable sail for just plain going to windward as well as other directions, wind angle directions. And it's a straightforward process of turning the boat into the wind, letting the square topsail go aback, the jibs go aback a little bit later, etc., etc., etc. And depending upon the strength of the wind and the state of the sea, the turning radius of a tack can be as large as about 3 boat lengths to as little as actually going backwards, because you've hit a square sea, a square wave, and the boat's been stalled and it winds up going backwards before you get it onto the new board. So we use all this all the time in terms of the square topsail and account for the radius based on the sea conditions and the wind conditions and the speed of the boat.
Can you just walk us through a general description of what a tack would be like?
Sure. So crew have positions to get to. We're handling a number of lines in a tack. I mean, even the mainsail, which is essentially a fore and aft sail that can self-tack, it's still got a number of things to deal with. The topping lifts need to be shifted. We have twin lifts, and so they have to be shifted to keep the sail curvature fair for the new tack. But then we have the braces and we have the headsails. As you go into the wind, you take in the slack of the headsails that occurs even though you've been on the wind, trimmed snug, and then the sails go back. At some point, there's a call as the ship is passed through the wind to pass everything over. We use just one code word. We just say "Lego," and that means the topsail comes around, the outermost headsail starts to be passed over, and then the next headsail, and then the next headsail if we have 3 set. The last sail to be passed over is the foresail, because we have mainmast stay forestays, twins, so one's lazy, collapsed, one's up and ahead, much like a forestay of a foremast. We have to switch those. So what will happen is after the tack, the foresail's still aback. That frees up the lazy mainstay to come forward, be cranked up. Then the previous stay gets eased off, brought back, and then the foresail is eased over. The sheets are unclipped and reclipped in the process of coming over. And there's a control line to keep the clew from flogging. And then we trim in. And then there's a bunch of running around making sure we've got the best trim for continuing to go to windward after the tack.
And then it's cleaning up the mess, coiling everything down, getting ready for the next one.
Yep.
So the next question we have, for those of you just tuning in, welcome. We're Coffee with Captain. We have Captain Jan Miles here, chief mate Jeff Crosby behind the camera. Next question is one from Mike. Did I see a reference about setting a square sail flying? And if so, what does that mean?
Sure. Flying generally means that you're setting from the deck all the way up to the top. But we have one square sail that is called a top gallant, and it is stitched onto a yard that we keep down on deck. And whenever we want to set it, after the 4th square top has been set, we are able to send this top gallant up. It's bundled, it's oriented to go up in a vertical way and then cross over, and there are crew that are sent up aloft to run out sheets and then pop the bundle out of its breakaway lashings, get the clews out to the yard arms of the topsail yard, and then the single halyard stretches the leeches of the top gallant. So it's done on the fly, and it does fly. We get into situations, particularly when we're striking and the wind is rising and we need to get her down, whereby it'll fly to leeward and aft, and it'll drift away like a kite, a pretty heavy kite, and we have a downhaul that we allow for being able to drag it in once we get it clear of the rig and it comes in from the side. So there have been some significant adventures with that sail in certain circumstances.
Sure have. I've been part of some of those. Absolutely. So you've been captain of the second Pride of Baltimore. You were a captain of the first Pride. This question is coming in from a Danelle. Do you have a favorite between Pride and Pride 2?
Yeah, that was quite the conversation the first year of this second vessel, for those of us who knew the first vessel very, very well. This vessel, the second vessel, is a much more comfortable vessel. And with her size, she's actually able to handle conditions really, really well. And so, in the main, this vessel is a very rewarding vessel to sail. The other vessel I sailed a lot down into the Caribbean, through the Great Lakes, in the Pacific, across the Atlantic to Europe and around in Europe, and into the Mediterranean. And I enjoyed her very, very much because she's also got her own natures, complex rig, a lot of choices to make between reefing and sails to set for various conditions. But with her size, she had a limit to her sea state that she could live with quite comfortably.
And that was due to the low freeboard?
Yeah, well, it's smaller size.
Sure, yeah.
And I mean, with a smaller size, it's somewhat styled of the day. The freeboard would be somewhat lower than would be for a vessel even her size. So this vessel, by being 20 feet longer, and also having U.S. Coast Guard certification, has a higher freeboard than would be classical. And her mass, she just is a much more comfortable sail vessel. She's significantly faster also, because when you're shoulder in, you're leaning over and shouldering in, dropping the topsides into the water, this vessel is somewhat more fair above the waterline than the other vessel. The other vessel was somewhat bluff above the water. She was a sharp boat to begin with, but when you put those 4 channels in the water, you're leaning over, say, 10 degrees, she's developing a lot of bluntness above the water. And so she's shouldering and shouldering and shouldering. And so going on the wind was something that you only did when the sea state was pretty slight. We're talking less than 4 feet or less. In this vessel, you can sustain 6 to 7 feet relatively well. It can be darned uncomfortable, but it can,
sure.
But it can work. And of course, both boats were vulnerable to head rig going in the water, so you never let that happen. You work really hard to avoid that.
Yeah, great answer. This one is kind of associated with that. It comes from Greg Bauer. Captain, you've been associated with Pride for decades. What started you with Pride, and what keeps you coming back?
So my first invitation to be a skipper for the first boat came in the winter of 81. So I had my first experience with her then, and I had been in the business of being a mate for quite a while on a number of vessels, starting in the early 70s. So this is a while later, and I'd been a skipper for a couple of winters with a windjammer type American that was out of Long Island and was working with the Rake cruises alongside Harbour-Gamage down in the St. Thomas area. So I did deliveries down, did the winter, deliveries back, and in that process I wound up being identified as a possible skipper for relieving Armin Alcesser. So that's my start. And as a vessel within the American fleet, these prides of Baltimore are a challenge. There's nothing simple about them. Sure, you can sail with a lot less of the gear, but if you're going to enjoy the rest of the gear, you've got to be on your toes all the time. So from a point of view as a sailor, this vessel is by far the most rewarding vessel I've ever, these two vessels have been the most rewarding sailing vessels I've ever had the privilege of commanding. And the mission keeps going, so why would I go anywhere else?
That's a great point. That's a very good point. For those of you that are just tuning in or have been watching this happen, you're watching Coffee with Captain. We have Captain Jan Miles here, Chief Mate Jeff Crosby behind the camera. We have another question. This is from Bob Glover. Is that your uncle in the picture that is above your shoulder?
Well, it's a compliment, Bob. Thank you very much. In fact, it's a period piece of a very famous captain of the 1812 war of a Baltimore schooner used as a privateer. The vessel was called the Chaucer, and this is Captain Boyle up over my shoulder. And Captain Boyle stands out among a number of standout masters of American privateers of the 1812 war. In his particular case, Captain Boyle played a propaganda card against the English by sailing over the Atlantic and being a privateer over there, but in his first two captures, he released them and said, go back to England and take this message. And this message was to go to an actual coffee house called Lloyd's, where brokers of insurance just sat around drinking coffee and taking insurance bids. And he announced this Captain Boyle with his proclamation. He quoted the British admiral who had described the blockade of the East Coast as having sufficient force with his armada of vessels to blockade lakes, bays, rivers, sounds, inlets, outlets. I mean, he went way over the top with his point that he could stop all American maritime activity at the time. Well, Captain Boyle quoted him, sent it to this proclamation echoing that he had sufficient force with his one boat, the Chaucer, to blockade all the rivers and the inlets and the outlets of the United Kingdom. And it created a fervor over there. A lot of marine freight in the UK. You got coal going to London, it means going around the south coast and going up in the Thames and elsewhere. So all those folks said, we're not going out there. We need the Royal Navy to guard us. But the Royal Navy was busy with the French Navy, keeping them bottled up in the continent against Napoleon. So this is greatly stressful to the English government, very embarrassing to the British Navy. They chased Boyle on the Chaucer around and around and around all that summer. There's a story, there's an accounting that he may have gotten close to being captured maybe 3 occasions, but got away. In total, it's told that there's some 17 prizes that he came away with. But the biggest story is the propaganda coup, and Captain Boyle is credited with that.
Oh, that's awesome. This just in from Jay Boland. What role did Peter Boudreau have in the construction of Pride 2?
He is the builder. He's the master shipwright, the master builder. The United States is interesting since the 60s with the sort of the social rebellion period of time. A lot of crafts got started as alternate lifestyles. And one of the things that exploded and continues to exist today is wooden boat building schools. So we have a lot of carpenter skill, but what we don't have is the master shipwright. That's not a school you go to easily. You do it in steel building and things like that, but not when it comes to, so they're self-identified or they're identified by others. Peter Boudreau comes from a long line of very talented mariners in his family, and he developed a skill actually while after coming from the Caribbean to the States in 1976. He stumbled into the construction of the first part of Baltimore. So he became sort of an apprentice, like many of them were at that time in '76, to Melbourne Smith's process of building this first boat. And then over a period of time and years later, sailing as a professional master, windjammers and private charter stuff. Eventually he got identified to build the Lady Maryland. And then when the accident happened with Private Baltimore, he was identified to build the second pride. So he's the guy who guided all the carpenters and he's the intermediary between the designer, Tom Gilmer, and of course consulting with the owners of the boat at the time, which is Pride Inc., because they were the builders. So he did he and all his team did an absolutely exquisite job with this vessel.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question in recently from Tom Price. Does Chaucer on deck, so we have a small boat that we have named Chaucer after Thomas Boyle's famous adventures on his boat, Chaucer. Does she have a sailing rig? Does she stay tight when she's in the water? And how does she sail?
Well, the Chaucer is the one we have, the Chaucer we have, is actually an English heritage design. Some people think she's a bit of a Whitehall, but no, her heritage comes from Europe. And we identified that design as a nod to the fact that the privateers were relatively poor, fastly put together to be used as tools for the world of privateering. This was an investment, spend as little as you could to invest and hope to get the maximum out of it. So some of their boats were captured, small boats, from the vessels they captured as privateers. So we've made this decision to take this design, and it's more of a European-esque pulling boat rather than sharp like a Whitehall. So she's very chunky, very low freeboard, very buoyant. She could carry a lot. And that was part of the reason for building her. She's clinker built, last Rake, and she sits dry. And yes, it takes a little while for her to swell up, but it's not a long time. When she's not loaded, she's fairly quick, but she's also a little bit funny to steer. She doesn't have a centerboard, so you're dealing with speed. You're dealing with relatively equal drafts, so she can take a while to turn. She's better to wear ship. As a general rule, but she can tack. It takes a lot of attention to detail. Maybe move your weight back aft in order to rise the bow to get her to swing around. Oh, go all the way forward. Like just go stand by the mast and she'll flip around that way to get the buoyancy form to help with that. It's a loose-footed spritsail rig, and she'll sail to windward. But because when she's light, she's so out of the water, there's a lot of leeway, so she doesn't really do much more than, let's say, 60, 70 degrees of effective made to windward on either board. She's pretty easy to row, and occasionally, in the early years, we would try to put the whole crew in there and see what that's like, and she carries a fairly decent freeboard even with the whole crew on board. So it's a nod to history in the context of captured boats, therefore not a Whitehall, and has been nicknamed the most expensive deck box. Because of all the stuff we put in it, largely geared towards the horrifying imagination of if we lost the second pride in the suddenness, the quickness that the first pride experienced, that it would float free, tied to the rubber boat that we have, the utility rigid bottom inflatable, and that it could go up and stay to the surface and be a source of resources for the survivors. Other than that, it's just another piece of maintenance.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you that are just joining us, you're watching Coffee with Captain. We have Captain Jan Miles here, Chief Mate Jeff Crosby behind the camera. Kip Files wrote in, says, "Hi, Jan." And Alex Hay, this will be available afterwards. It will be up on our Facebook. And Greg Bauer has another question that he just submitted in. Been on a day sail, really enjoy hearing the history of Baltimore and the role of Clippers in general. Do you enjoy history in general or pick up these stories related to Baltimore Clippers over the years? So where have you compiled your history of these boats?
Exposure.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm a good listener. I'm very interested in what makes the vessel the way she is. So over the years, I've had a lot of reflecting time, and I've listened to others that have done more of the reading than I have. And so my interest is the use of the vessel, the translation of my experience of the vessel, and how it might have been back then, recognizing there's a significant difference. The strength and materials of this vessel allow us to sail this vessel in a way that it's unlikely they could really come to the same degree of aggressiveness or strength of wind for all the sails, just this different materials. So, but I'm listening to others. We've got a lot of folks that have read a lot of history who remind me of certain factors. Now, the big mystery is the rake. There is no primary story as to why the rake. And a number of historians have tried to get into it. The very first was, of course, Howard Chappell during the Public Works days when they did research in the 30s. They found no primary evidence other than the fact that the rake exists. And so they interviewed older mariners of the day, so 80-year-old, 90-year-old mariners in the 30s would not have lived back in the day when they created rake to the degree that it's habitual with Chesapeake Bay watercraft. And
just a point of clarification, the term rake is the angle that the masts are leaning back, and it's a very distinctive feature of this vessel and the previous Pride, as well as this era of Chesapeake Bay watercraft.
Yeah, and you see rake on some of the other vessels that sail today, the Californian out on the west coast, the Lynx here on the east coast. The Shenandoah was the first one to do it as starting in the 60s. So we don't know where rake comes from. So speculative about that. I have my theories. Howard Chappell wrote that the interviews came up with it's either a story of cargo handling, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you really look at it. It's a story of speed, and that makes maybe a 2-3% contribution. Herreshoff used rake in some balancing between yacht client and a racing client for the same vessel. There's an interesting story there. But in the end, the third one, strength, seems to be the one that I would say has to do with everything. And strength would be, back in the days, I think, when there wasn't a lot of rope for standing rigging.
Yeah.
And maybe a superstition for going downwind, which is what you wanted to do anyway. Who would want to go to windward, except in ideal circumstances? So maybe they leaned it back when they didn't have any standing rigging. And of course, when you do lean back and you do put in standing rigging, it's more like a preventer. You just plumb bob it down straight, gravity, and then out to the side, and acts as a triangulation with the mast in the fourth-day. So it's a very low tension way of keeping a mast in place. You don't have to crank the shrouds really, really hard to keep the mast from falling over. And so it has a lot of merit, but I would say the number of degrees we have, which is 13 and a half in the fore and 15 and a half degrees in the main, is that it is extreme by almost 3 times. To have the effectiveness of rake for strength, you don't need more than 4 to 6 degrees, 8 at the maximum. So, like I say, it's extreme. And while it's a great trademark, an American trademark, although rake existed elsewhere during the day, it wasn't as prevalent as it was adopted in Chesapeake Bay. It's our trademark, and we make use of it by keeping the yards braced around so it all looks like to the layman that it's a shipwreck playing alongside the dock, but in fact it draws them, and then they look and then you discover it's beautiful. What is it? Where is it from? And Baltimore gets its modern recognition in part because of that.
Can you describe a little bit the challenges of sailing a boat with this amount of rake versus a boat with straight up and down masts?
Well, okay, so challenge. There's no real challenge. It's just recognizing how the system works. The boat is well balanced in the context of design when we're talking about the balance of the vessel, the business of weather helm, all that sort of stuff. What becomes the necessity to recognize as to why things work the way they work is that in light air, and you're trying to broad reach, you have to tackle the fact that the boom wants to stay amidships. And that heavy boom has to be pulled out with tackle. And in really light air, what's weird is that the gaffs will hang in. So you can have the boom way out. We only have the one boom on the mainsail. You can have the boom way out, but the gaff is halfway in based on the leach. And when it comes to the foresail, which is loose-footed, that means the sail just won't billow out at all. So in very light air, it's very hard to go pretty broad to the wind. Now, in also really light air, because of the rake of the forestays, the sails have a tendency to hang like curtains, whereas more vertical stays that will tend to swing more like a door. But once you get a breeze, then one of the advantages that we inherit with rake is that when the boom does go out, it goes up.
Yeah.
Because as the boom swings out, the rake effect no longer applies as much as it did before, because the mass is true port and starboard, but is raked back. So the boom goes higher and higher and higher. So some modern boats and some great classics, yachts, there's a photograph recently that's been in the social media about a big J vessel. That boom was huge, and it's horizontal to the horizon. It's way out there. Same with Blue Nose 2. And if she were to be in a big sea with a big main and all the way out there, it wouldn't be very hard to put that boom in the water. But in our case, the boom goes higher and higher and higher. It's not easy to, we're not sensitive to the business of her going into the water. It doesn't not happen, but it's very rare that it happens.
Sure, absolutely. This question is coming in from Julie, who is a past guest crew with us. What characteristics make for the best crew members and best guest crew members?
You know, I think I'm going to ask the chief mate to answer that question. He has to face them every minute, whereas I can just sort of say, we're going to do this with a boat, and then I can turn away.
I mean, there's, I think, a lot of different factors that go into this. I mean, we could talk about skill set and what you're bringing to the boat and how proficient a sailor you are. But really, I think it comes down to attitude. You know, your attitude, your willingness to be able to work as a team, to really invest in what the boat is doing and getting the boat from point A to point B, and all of those bits and pieces that are in between, I think is one of the most important aspects for a crew member or a guest crew member.
Absolutely. When we do the guest crew member program, the original idea, and hence the phrase guest crew member, is we're delivering the vessel from mission execution location to another mission execution location. And unlike many of our traditional sailing ship community across the country, we're oriented towards being in port, and a lot of them are oriented towards having programs underway, staying at sea, staying underway for days at a time. And so our voyage is a delivery, and we need to make it efficient. So the crew is about getting the vessel delivered to venue and venue and venue. And so guest crew are given an opportunity to participate with a hired crew to get the boat from A to B. We can move the boat with just the crew. We're enough. We can voyage all the way across the Atlantic with just us, or any ocean. But when we have guest crew, that adds to the labor force, that adds to the general spread of the work. And so that attitude that Jeff was describing is really critical. A positive attitude, a willingness to get engaged, a recognition that you could go too far so that you need to be the throttle on, not doing something that you're either afraid of or unprepared for. Mm. It's a community, and we need that community in a positive, collaborative mindset. That's what we're looking for.
As somebody who has sailed this boat all over the place, can you describe what a larger, say, ocean crossing passage would be like on this boat?
So the emotional story is everybody's so excited. Mm. And that excitement takes a little while to become routine. So with a Atlantic crossing, we're roughly 3 weeks to go across. We allow for about 3 weeks to go across. We've done it in less, 17 days is a general average. So about 4 or 5 days, certainly no sooner than about 3 days, the emotional sense is, okay, my horizon is gone to just the next watch or the next 4 hours or the next meal. We think ashore, we think a lot longer than that. So then we get into a hubbub of every day is just the same. It's except for weather, except for sail adjustments. And then about 2/3 of the way through the distance in time, you start getting, when are we going to get there? When are we going to get there?
Yeah, can we go faster? Can we go faster?
So that's one cycle of truth that I've witnessed. Otherwise, it is a small island community all by itself, dependent upon itself. So you find different ways of breaking the rhythm a little bit. So we might have a swizzle party once a week. And we might create it as a dress-up event once a week. So it would be horrifying to the more traditionalist, but there's also movie night.
Yeah.
So the funniest one that I ever saw was we're roaring across the Eastern Pacific. We hit the trains coming out of Panama. It takes a while to get to the longitude of Acapulco. And then we have still more than 2,000 miles to get to Hawaii, and that's when the trade winds come in, is when you hit that longitude of Acapulco. So now we're roaring. We've got 25 knots of wind true, which is roughly 18 to 20 across the boat. We've got everything set. We're making 10, 11 knots, 9, 10, 11 knots, or in an 8 to 10 foot sea. So Sunday was matinee day. So they pick up this TV, they put it on deck, we're all back aft, they got it all going. And so we're blasting along, and we're watching, suddenly I lost the memory of what the movie was, but it was one of these modern sailing movies. I can't remember what it is. I'm sorry, I lost the point. But the point is what a contrast, right? You're roaring across with this traditional vessel, and just as the halyard to the Tagalan parted.
Oh, wow.
It's a single part.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's hard to change the nip and the wear point on the without going up, lowering it down, retying it, shifting it. So we had sort of dismissed the need to do that, and so it parted. So there was a big scramble, not big danger. I mean, it's got the 2 sheets.
Yeah, kind of just hangs there, yeah.
So the only thing to do is and it's sort of lopsided down on the leader side of it a little bit. So you just reattach the halyard again and then get it all down in the normal way. So I wish I could remember the name of that movie. It was, it might be something as modern contemporary as the Monty Python stuff, but it was something that was sort of iconically weird. I can't remember what the movie was.
Ah, well, shoot, next time. Well, thank you guys for joining in with us. If you have any more questions, feel free to send them our way, and we'll be able to answer them next time. But hopefully this has been a good respite, good getting out of the house for some of you. Do you have any parting words for us?
Well, stay safe, folks. We're going to beat this situation by being very, very respectful of the risks. So stay safe.
All right. Thank you, guys.